Steve Jobs is often remembered as a genius of products. The Macintosh, Pixar, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and the modern Apple Store devices. It is a story about a man who turned taste into power, who made technology feel personal, who could see what people wanted before they could explain it, and who often hurt the people closest to him while doing it. The central question of the book is not whether Jobs was brilliant. The evidence is everywhere. The harder question is what kind of brilliance he had, what it cost, and why it worked in some moments while becoming destructive in others. Isaacson does not smooth Jobs into a clean role model. He shows a person full of contradictions, abandoned and chosen, spiritual and ruthless, artistic and technical, controlling and collaborative, visionary and blind to his own body. If you want the full movement of the book, you have to hold both sides together. Jobs did not build Apple because he was simply nice, simply cruel, simply lucky, or simply talented. He built it because he fused several forces that rarely live inside one person. A craftsman's demand for hidden excellence, a marketer's instinct for drama, a designer's hatred of clutter, a founder's hunger for control, and a child's wound around abandonment that kept returning in different forms. The biography begins before Apple, before computers, before the black turtleneck. It begins with adoption. Jobs was born to Joan Schiebel and Abdul Fattah Jandali, but he was raised by Paul and Clara Jobs. That fact shaped him in two opposite ways. On one side, he insisted that Paul and Clara were his real parents, not placeholders. On the other side, the knowledge that he had been given up left a deep emotional mark. Isaacson keeps returning to this because Jobs himself kept returning to it. He could feel chosen and rejected at the same time. That tension matters because Jobs later treated products, teams, friends, and family with a similar either-or intensity. Something was either perfect or garbage. Someone was either enlightened or useless. A design was either pure or polluted. A person was either inside his circle or outside it. The child who had been adopted into a loving home grew into a man who wanted the world around him to prove, again and again, that he had been chosen for something extraordinary. Paul Jobs gave him one of the most important lessons of his life. Paul was a mechanic and a craftsman. He taught Steve that the back of a cabinet should be finished properly even if nobody sees it. That lesson became one of the hidden engines of Apple's product culture. Jobs would later obsess over parts of computers and devices customers would never inspect. The inside mattered because the maker knew. For Jobs, craftsmanship was not only about appearance. It was a moral standard. Picture a young builder learning that the hidden back of a cabinet matters even when no customer will see it. What would you expect that lesson to create later? Prettier surfaces, or a deeper refusal to let the inside and outside disagree? The actual answer was the deeper refusal. Hidden quality became a way of judging the whole product. At the same time, Jobs learned early that he could bend ordinary rules. He was smart, restless, and often difficult. He played pranks, resisted school routines, and looked for people who would tolerate his intensity. He was not the kind of child who quietly fit into a system. He needed teachers, friends, and adults who could see that the disruptive behavior came with unusual curiosity. The pattern repeated later. Jobs often needed people who could survive him long enough to benefit from him. Then came Steve Wozniak. The two Steves were a strange pairing. Wozniak was gentle, playful, technically gifted, and less hungry for power. Jobs was not the engineer Woz was, but he saw what Woz's creations could become in the world. Woz could make beautiful circuits. Jobs could imagine selling them, packaging them, dramatizing them, and turning them into a movement. Picture the early scene. A shy engineering wizard builds something elegant because it delights him, and a hungry young salesman looks at the same thing. What would you expect to matter more, the circuit itself or the story around it? The actual result was that both mattered, but Jobs understood the missing half. Wozniak's technical brilliance needed Jobs' sense of meaning, theater, and market pressure before it could become Apple. Their friendship grew out of electronics, pranks, and a counterculture atmosphere where hacking meant freedom. Jobs dropped into worlds that seemed to contradict each other. Silicon Valley engineering, acid-era experimentation, Zen practice, vegetarian diets, India, and intense business ambition. Isaacson shows that these were not separate phases. They became ingredients in Jobs' later style. He wanted technology that felt intuitive, almost spiritual. He wanted machines stripped of unnecessary complexity. He wanted products that gave ordinary people access to power previously locked inside expert systems. Before Apple, Jobs worked at Atari and traveled to India. Atari taught him the rough, urgent world of product engineering and games. India did not give him a simple enlightenment story, but it deepened his interest in intuition, simplicity, and inner certainty. Jobs later trusted intuition with a force that could look visionary or reckless, depending on the outcome. He often believed that rational market research could not find a future because consumers did not yet know how to ask for it. The Apple I showed the first version of the pattern. Woz built the machine, Jobs saw the business. He pushed the idea beyond hobbyist pleasure into a sellable product. Then the Apple II turned the company into something much larger. It was not just a board for enthusiasts. It was a personal computer that could enter homes and schools. Jobs wanted the casing, the look, and the experience to matter. He did not want technology to feel like a kit for insiders. He wanted it to arrive as an object of desire. This is one of the book's core ideas. Jobs believed the boundary between technology and the humanities was artificial. A product was not great because the circuit worked. It was great when engineering, design, emotion, and story met inside one experience. The Apple II made that belief visible, even though Jobs was still young, erratic, and not yet fully in control of his own company or himself. Picture a young computer company deciding whether the machine should feel like a kit or a finished object. What would you expect ordinary families and schools to trust more? Exposed technical cleverness, or a complete experience that already feels ready for them? The actual answer pushed Jobs toward the complete experience. Success intensified his best and worst traits. Apple went public. Jobs became wealthy and famous while still emotionally immature. The biography does not let the reader separate the company's rise from the personal damage around him. His relationship with Chris and Brennan and his denial of responsibility for Lisa, his daughter, show how cruel he could become when reality threatened the story he wanted to tell about himself. He could demand total honesty in products while avoiding honesty in his own personal life. That contradiction is painful because it is not separate from the rest of the biography. The same man who insisted on integrity inside a machine could deny a child. The same mind that saw hidden product flaws could refuse to see emotional obligations directly in front of him. Isaacson's portrait is strongest when it refuses to turn genius into moral permission. Jobs' achievements were real, and so were the wounds he left. Then came Xerox PARC, Lisa, and the graphical user interface. Jobs and Apple saw ideas that would help shape the future of personal computing: Windows, icons, a mouse, and a more visual way to interact with machines. Jobs did not invent every piece, but he saw the possibility with unusual clarity. Many people can witness a future and miss it. Jobs saw it and wanted to make it real. Imagine you're watching a demo of a graphical interface when most computers still feel like command line machines for specialists. What would you expect the breakthrough to be? The technical idea itself, or the discipline to turn the idea into a product normal people can love? What actually happened was that Jobs seized on the interface not as a feature, but as a philosophy. The computer should meet the human, not force the human to think like a computer. The Lisa project carried some of that future, but it also revealed Jobs' management problems. He was demanding, volatile, and often impossible. He could inspire people to do work they did not think they could do, but he could also humiliate them. He divided the world into the brilliant and the worthless. The reality distortion field became a phrase people used to describe his ability to bend perception, deadline, confidence, and fear. Sometimes it pushed teams through impossible barriers. Sometimes it became denial with better branding. The Macintosh became the first great mythic product of Jobs' career. It was a machine, but also a rebellion. Jobs framed it as a revolution against dull corporate computing. The team became a pirate crew inside Apple. The product's design, typography, interface, launch event, and advertising all mattered. Jobs wanted the Mac to feel like a declaration. Computers could be friendly, beautiful, and liberating. But the Mac also revealed the danger of Jobs' perfectionism. His standards could produce elegance, but his refusal to compromise could damage timing, price, performance, and relationships. He wanted a closed system, tight control, and an integrated experience. That instinct later became central to Apple's success. But in the early Mac era, it also helped create business weakness. The product was beautiful, but not enough people bought it fast enough. John Sculley entered as the experienced executive Jobs believed Apple needed. Jobs famously challenged him with the choice between selling sugared water and changing the world. The phrase mattered because Jobs understood that people do not only choose jobs for salary. They choose stories about who they will become. He recruited through identity. To work with Jobs was to join a mission. Yet Jobs and Sculley became locked in a power struggle. Jobs wanted control. Sculley and the board wanted stability. The company that Jobs had helped create pushed him out of power. For Jobs, this was humiliation and exile. But Isaacson shows that exile was also apprenticeship. Away from Apple, Jobs would fail, learn, refine, and return with a stronger version of the instincts he had not yet learned how to manage. Away from Apple, Jobs used Next to attempt the perfect computer company without the constraints of his old home. It was elegant, expensive, over-designed, and commercially limited. The Next machine showed Jobs' obsession with beauty and integration, but it also showed what happened when perfection floated too far away from market reality. He could create an object that impressed the mind and still miss the larger business. Suppose a founder is forced out, starts a new company, and spends enormous energy making a machine almost too beautiful for its market. Would you expect that failure to be wasted? The actual result was stranger. Next did not become a mass-market computer success, but its software later became a bridge back to Apple. Jobs' apparent detour became part of the road home. Pixar was the other half of exile, and in many ways it changed Jobs more deeply. He bought into a company that joined technology and art. At first, Pixar struggled. It sold hardware, made short films, and searched for a business model. Jobs poured money into it and often clashed with the creative people around him. But Pixar eventually became the place where his technology and humanity's ideal came alive in a different medium. Toy Story changed Pixar and changed Jobs. It proved that computer animation could carry emotion, story, humor, and commercial power. Jobs was not the storyteller in the way John Lasseter and the creative team were, but he became a crucial negotiator, owner, and strategist. Pixar gave him a second identity. Not only the founder pushed out of Apple, but the head of a company that could transform an industry. Pixar also taught a lesson Apple would later use. Technology is not enough. The audience does not care that an animation system is advanced if the story is dead. Tools matter because they enable feeling. This reinforced Jobs' deepest belief. The point of technology was not technical display. The point was to make something emotionally alive. During these years, Jobs also became more of a family man, though never a simple one. His relationship with Laureen Powell, their children, and his daughter Lisa added complexity to the portrait. Isaacson does not pretend Jobs suddenly became gentle. He could be affectionate, withdrawn, controlling, funny, and harsh inside the same home. His personal life did not resolve the contradictions. It made them more visible. The Apple he returned to in the late 1990s was near collapse. The product line was confused. The company had lost focus. Jobs' return was not just a sentimental founder comeback. It was a brutal act of simplification. He cut products, clarified priorities, made the famous grid of consumer and professional, desktop and portable, and forced Apple to stop scattering its energy. This is where one of his great management strengths becomes clear. Jobs could say no with unusual force. Many leaders want to add. Jobs wanted to subtract until the essential thing remained. He saw focus not as a slogan, but as a knife. A company could not become great by doing everything. It had to decide what deserved all its attention and what had to die. The Think Different campaign captured the emotional reset. Apple was no longer only selling computers. It was selling a way of seeing the world. Creative rebels, artists, inventors, misfits, and people who changed reality because they refused to accept it as fixed. The campaign worked because it described both Apple's desired customers and Jobs' desired self-image. It turned brand identity into a mirror. But the restoration of Apple was not only advertising. Jobs rebuilt the product culture. His partnership with Johnny Ive became one of the most important creative relationships in the book. I've had the design sensitivity, and Jobs had the power to make design central rather than decorative. Together, they made simplicity a company religion. The iMac was the first visible sign of the renewed Apple. Colorful, approachable, and unlike the beige boxes around it. Picture a computer market full of dull machines, confusing model names, and technical language. What would you expect a struggling company to do first? Compete on specifications, or make a computer that looks like it belongs in a home? The results showed Jobs' instinct. The iMac did not win by being a normal machine with a better checklist. It won by making the computer feel friendly, designed, and alive. Jobs' return also meant a return to control. He wanted Apple to own the whole experience. Hardware, software, stores, packaging, marketing, and presentation. Critics often saw this as restrictive. Jobs saw it as necessary. If the user experience depended on a loose chain of companies, no one would be responsible for the whole. Integration was his answer to fragmentation. The Apple stores show this clearly. Many people thought retail was risky. Computer stores were often cluttered, confusing, and unpleasant. Jobs wanted a controlled physical space where people could experience the brand directly. The stores were not just sales channels. They were product demonstrations, service centers, classrooms, and temples of simplicity. The Genius Bar made technical help part of the brand experience rather than an afterthought. The digital hub strategy moved Apple beyond the computer as a standalone object. Jobs saw that cameras, music players, and other devices were creating a new digital lifestyle, and the Mac could become the center of it. This was not yet the iPhone world. It was the bridge to it. The computer organized the music, photos, and creative life of a user. The iPod was the moment Apple stepped decisively into consumer electronics. Other MP3 players existed, but they were often clumsy. The iPod made the experience simple. A small white device, a wheel, a clear promise of carrying a large music library. Again, the breakthrough was not only technical. It was interface, hardware, software, packaging, and emotional clarity. Then iTunes and the iTunes Store attacked the chaos of digital music. The music industry feared piracy and loss of control. Jobs offered a legal, simple, paid alternative that made sense to customers. He did not solve every tension in the industry, but he used Apple's integrated system to create a new market behavior. Buy a song easily, sync it easily, carry it easily. The full chain mattered. Suppose music labels are terrified, customers are downloading songs illegally, and technology companies are making awkward devices. What would you expect to win? Stricter control from the old industry, or a simple legal path that feels easier than piracy? What actually happened was that the easier experience changed behavior. Jobs understood that moral lectures rarely beat frictionless design. Pixar, meanwhile, continued to grow. Jobs' role there gave him leverage, wealth, and another public victory. The Disney relationship moved from dependence and tension toward a deal that made Pixar central to the future of animation. Jobs' ability as a negotiator sharpened here. He was not only a product showman. He could wait, pressure, frame, and use timing. The biography's middle and later sections show Jobs operating at a level where taste becomes strategy. With modern Macs, Apple kept separating itself from commodity computing. With the stores, it controlled the buying environment. With iTunes and iPod, it controlled music. With Pixar, Jobs helped prove digital art could dominate mainstream cinema. Each success reinforced the same lesson. Do not treat design as surface. Design is how the system works. But Isaacson also keeps showing the human cost of that system. Jobs' intensity could create extraordinary work, but it could also create fear. Employees could be inspired one moment and crushed the next. He often used blunt judgments to force clarity. Some people did their best work because of his pressure. Others were damaged by it. The book does not give a simple verdict because the reality was not simple. The iPhone is the clearest example of Jobs' late career power. It combined phone, iPod, and internet communicator into one device. But the deeper shift was not the combination of categories. It was the removal of the old phone interface. Jobs and Apple bet on a touch screen, software flexibility, and a device that could become many things through apps and updates. The phone became a platform for daily life. Imagine holding the first iPhone idea before the market understands it. A phone without a physical keyboard seems risky. What would you expect business experts to ask for? More familiar buttons or a glass screen controlled by software? The actual outcome revealed the Jobs pattern again. Removing the keyboard looked like subtraction, but it created a larger possibility. The device could change identity because the interface was not frozen in plastic. The iPad extended the same logic into the post-PC era. Critics asked whether it was just a large phone or a small laptop. Jobs saw a third category: intimate, portable, direct, and simple. Whether every prediction around it came true in the same way is less important than the strategic instinct. He kept looking for the place where technology could become less technical and more bodily, more touchable, more immediate. Cloud services and a larger Apple ecosystem pointed beyond individual devices. Jobs' final Apple vision was not one product, but a connected environment. Hardware, software, services, stores, media, and identity all reinforced each other. The more integrated the system became, the more Apple's strength depended on the very control that critics had long questioned. Yet the biography's late movement is shadowed by illness. Jobs was diagnosed with a form of pancreatic cancer that was initially more treatable than the common kind, but he delayed surgery while pursuing alternative approaches. Isaacson treats this as one of the most consequential examples of Jobs' dangerous confidence and intuition. The same distrust of conventional limits that helped him build products did not serve him well against cancer. This is one of the hardest lessons of the book. Reality distortion can move teams, investors, partners, and customers. It cannot reliably move biology. Jobs' willpower was enormous, but the body did not obey the same rules as a product schedule. His illness forced the biography to test the limits of his central method. If a person has spent a lifetime bending markets, teams, and deadlines through will, what would you expect him to do when doctors tell him his body has a narrow window for treatment? The actual result was tragic. Jobs tried to control the story in ways that may have cost him time. The habit that created miracles in product rooms became dangerous when the problem demanded medical surrender. His illness also revealed his secrecy and his complicated relationship with responsibility. Apple depended on him, but he resisted full transparency. Investors, employees, board members, family, and the public all had stakes in the truth of his condition. Jobs wanted privacy and control. The company needed continuity. Isaacson shows the tension without turning it into a courtroom verdict. In the final years, Jobs kept working on products, Apple Park, and the future of the company. The image is not of a man gently retiring into reflection. He remained intense, involved, opinionated, and restless. He cared about the campus, about design, about the next version, about the legacy of the company. Even near death, he thought in terms of systems and taste. The final chapter turns directly to legacy. Jobs wanted Apple to outlast him. He did not want it to become a company that simply asked, "What would Steve do?" His deeper hope was that Apple had absorbed a way of thinking, focus, integration, simplicity, willingness to cannibalize old products, and the courage to live at the intersection of technology and liberal arts. But the book also asked the viewer to separate legacy from worship. Jobs' methods worked partly because of his unusual gifts, partly because of the historical moment, partly because of the teams around him, and partly because the market rewarded the kind of integration he loved. Copying his cruelty does not copy his taste. Copying his bluntness does not copy his insight. Copying his black turtleneck does not copy his ability to see and experience whole. The first major lesson is that products are experiences, not feature lists. Jobs cared about the full journey. Opening the box, touching the object, seeing the interface, visiting the store, syncing the media, hearing the presentation, and feeling the brand promise. He understood that people judge technology through emotion as much as logic. A device can be technically impressive and still fail if the experience feels confusing or dead. The second lesson is that focus is violent in the best sense. It kills options. Jobs' return to Apple worked because he removed distractions. Focus did not mean saying yes to a priority while quietly keeping every side project alive. It meant choosing what would not exist. For a viewer building anything, this is uncomfortable. The question is not only what you value, it is what you're willing to disappoint. The third lesson is that design is a moral language. From Paul Jobs' cabinets to Ive Studio, the book returns to the idea that hidden quality matters. A product teaches its maker how to think. If you tolerate ugliness inside the system because the customer may not notice, you train the organization to accept compromise. Jobs' best design instinct was the refusal to separate inside from outside. Imagine a team deciding whether to polish a hidden detail no customer may ever inspect. What would you expect a normal cost calculation to say? Skip it, or spend the time because the team itself will know. The actual Jobs answer was to spend the time when the hidden detail shaped the culture. The fourth lesson is that intensity needs conscience. Jobs' pressure could produce astonishing work, but the biography makes it impossible to call every wound necessary. Some people around him became stronger. Some were simply hurt. The practical lesson is not to become softer in standards. It is to understand that standards and humiliation are not the same thing. A leader can demand excellence without making cruelty part of the method. The fifth lesson is that intuition is powerful but not universal. Jobs' intuition about products was often extraordinary because it was trained by years of taste, usage, attention, and argument. But when he applied the same certainty to areas where he lacked expertise, the results could be dangerous. The viewer should not learn "trust your gut" as a slogan. The better lesson is train your taste, know your domain, and be humble where reality has different rules. Picture a person praised for seeing what customers cannot yet explain. What would you expect him to trust when a new decision appears? The trained instinct that made him great, or the expert boundary that tells him this domain is different? The actual lesson is that instinct needs a domain. Outside the domain, confidence can become blindness. The sixth lesson is that storytelling changes what people believe is possible. Jobs did not merely launch products. He staged them. He gave them a place in a larger narrative. Rebellion, creativity, simplicity, the future arriving now. This could be manipulative, but it could also be clarifying. A great product still needs a story that helps people understand why it matters. The seventh lesson is that the best teams around Jobs were not passive followers. Wozniak, Ive, Lasseter, Ed Catmull, Tim Cook, and many others matter because they supplied what Jobs did not have. Engineering grace, design craft, operational discipline, creative storytelling, patient management, and organizational continuity all appear in the biography. Jobs was central, but he was not alone. The myth of the solitary genius is too small for the actual story. There is another layer beneath the product chronology. Jobs repeatedly tried to make companies behave like creative organisms rather than ordinary bureaucracies. At Apple in the early years, this produced energy and chaos. He loved small teams, direct confrontation, fast decisions, and the feeling that a product group was on a mission against the dullness of the world. He hated committees because committees diluted taste. He hated market research when it became a substitute for judgment. He hated compromise when it allowed everyone to feel reasonable while the product became forgettable. That hatred of mediocrity was useful, but it also made him impatient with the slow work of human development. Some leaders build institutions by making people around them more secure. Jobs often build intensity by making people less secure. The Mac team felt chosen because it was separated from the rest of Apple and given a heroic identity. But the same chosen feeling could turn into arrogance, rivalry, and exhaustion. Isaacson's biography shows how easily creative intensity can become tribal pride. The Lisa and Macintosh years are especially important because they reveal a mistake Jobs later learned to correct. He wanted integrated products, but he did not yet know how to align vision with business discipline. He wanted beautiful interfaces, but memory, cost, speed, software libraries, sales channels, and compatibility all mattered too. In those years, his taste was ahead of many customers, but his impatience could make the product harder to sell. Later, when he returned to Apple, he still wanted control, but he had more respect for focus, supply chains, launch timing, and operational execution. Picture a visionary founder with a beautiful interface and weak organizational patience. What would you expect to fail first? The idea or the system needed to carry the idea into a market? The actual answer in the Lisa and Macintosh years was the system. Later, Apple needed both vision and operating discipline. That is why Tim Cook matters in the biography, even though he is not as theatrical as Jobs. Cook represented the operational discipline Jobs did not personally embody. Jobs could simplify the product line and demand excellence, but Apple also needed someone who could make the machine run. Inventory, manufacturing, suppliers, distribution, margins, and timing. The later Apple was not only a design studio. It was a design-led operating system for a global business. Jobs supplied the taste and the forcing function. Cook helped turn that taste into repeatable execution. The book also makes clear that Jobs' product judgment was not magic in the lazy sense. He studied details. He argued over corners, colors, materials, fonts, transitions, stores, ads, and packaging. His intuition was fed by attention. When people call something instinct, they can miss the years of looking behind it. Jobs' taste was trained by calligraphy, electronics, Zen aesthetics, Bauhaus-like simplicity, music, architecture, industrial design, and constant comparison between what felt alive and what felt dead. A useful viewer question is this: if you remove the drama from Jobs, what would remain? The answer is not one thing. You would still have a person unusually sensitive to experience. He noticed friction. He noticed ugliness. He noticed when a product asked the user to do work the product should do. He noticed when a story had no emotional center. The drama made him famous, but the sensitivity made him dangerous in the market. This is also why his relationship with Johnny Ive becomes so important. Ive did not merely make objects pretty after engineers had finished. In the renewed Apple, design became upstream. It shaped the product's reason for being. Jobs, and I've shared a belief that removing complexity was not a cosmetic act. It was the work. A simple surface often required a more complex internal effort. The easier the product felt for the user, the more discipline the company had to absorb on the user's behalf. Think about that for a moment. A customer opens a product and sees one clean object, one clear button, one natural gesture. What would you expect behind that simplicity? Less work or more work? The actual answer in Jobs' Apple was more work. The company hid complexity from the user by taking responsibility for it internally. Simplicity was not laziness. It was transferred labor. The same principle appears in packaging. For Jobs, the box was not trash around the product. It was the first physical scene in the user's relationship with Apple. The unboxing mattered because it set a tone: care, clarity, anticipation, and control. This may sound small until you realize how often companies treat first impressions as accidental. Jobs treated them as part of the product. The biography's treatment of music also adds depth to Jobs' character. Music was not a side hobby. It shaped his sense of identity and taste. He admired artists who were intense, perfectionist, rebellious, and emotionally direct. His love of Dylan, the Beatles, and other musicians connected with his own desire to join art and technology. When Apple entered music, Jobs was not merely seeing a market. He was entering a world that mattered to him personally. The iPod and iTunes era also shows the power of controlling both the object and the transaction. Other companies could build players. Other companies could sell downloads. Apple's advantage came from making the whole path feel like one thought. Find a song, buy the song, store the song, carry the song, love the device. That continuity was the product. The iPod was not only a music player. It was the visible tip of a system. The iPhone intensified that system logic. The old mobile phone industry was shaped by carriers, hardware keyboards, nested menus, and compromises. Jobs wanted to break the carrier-driven experience and make the device feel like a pocket computer designed around the human hand. The touchscreen mattered because it allowed the interface to change. But the larger principle was that software could become the product's living surface. This is one of the reasons the iPhone launch became so powerful. Jobs did not present a phone as a checklist. He built suspense around 3 products and then revealed that they were one. That was theater, but it was also explanation. He helped the audience understand the category shift emotionally before they had time to reduce it to specifications. Great product storytelling does not hide the truth. It arranges the truth so people can feel its importance. Imagine a launch audience hearing 3 promises: a music player, a phone, and an internet communicator. What would you expect the reveal to be? 3 devices on a table, or 1 object that changes the category? The actual reveal worked because one object carried all three promises. The theater clarified the product logic. There is a caution here for anyone copying him. Jobs could use theater because the product usually carried the weight of the theater. If the object had been weak, the presentation would have become empty hype. His best launches worked because the drama and the product reinforced each other. The promise was big, but the user could touch the proof. The cancer chapters changed the emotional temperature of the biography. Until then, Jobs' refusal to accept limits often feels like a business force. In illness, it becomes frightening. He had access to doctors, information, wealth, and options. Yet his habits of control and alternative intuition delayed conventional treatment. Isaacson does not reduce this to stupidity. It is more tragic than that. Jobs had spent his life trusting inner certainty against outside doubt. That habit had been rewarded in public again and again. When the domain changed, the habit did not change fast enough. This is where the biography becomes more than a business book. It becomes a study of transfer failure. A strength in one domain can become weakness in another. The ability to ignore skeptics helped Jobs make the Macintosh, Pixar, iPod, iPhone, and iPad possible. The inability to recognize when skepticism was actually expertise became dangerous. The viewer should notice this because many successful people make the same mistake at smaller scale. They win in one arena and begin treating the method as universal law. Another prediction moment belongs here. Imagine a leader whose strongest advantage is refusing to accept ordinary limits. In a product meeting, would you expect that trait to create breakthroughs? Often, yes. But what happens when the situation is medical, legal, or technical outside the leader's actual expertise? The result in Jobs' life shows the boundary. The same refusal that can energize a team can also block the humility needed to survive reality. The family material also resists easy summary. Jobs could be deeply moved by his children and still emotionally absent. He could seek connection and then retreat into work. He could care about Lisa and still have caused her great pain. His later attempts at relationship did not erase earlier denial. This matters because the biography is not only asking what Jobs built. It asks what he could not repair or repaired only partly. In that sense, Lisa is one of the book's moral centers. The daughter he denied became a living reminder of the gap between Jobs' public insistence on excellence and his private failure of responsibility. His eventual relationship with her had real tenderness, but the early wound remained part of the story. Isaacson's decision to keep that thread alive prevents the reader from escaping into product admiration alone. The boardroom and succession material also reveals a final maturity. Jobs eventually chose Tim Cook as the person to carry Apple forward, not because Cook was another Steve Jobs, but because he could lead the company as an institution. That choice matters. Founders often damage their companies by needing successors to imitate them. Jobs, at least in principle, understood that Apple needed to preserve values, not costume. Those values were not vague. Focus, end-to-end responsibility, taste, small teams of strong players, the willingness to cannibalize your own product before someone else does, the belief that players want to work with players, the refusal to let finance or sales alone define the product, the conviction that technology should be married to the humanities. These are the reproducible parts of Jobs' legacy, though even they require judgment. Imagine a successor trying to preserve a founder's company after the founder is gone. What would you expect to matter more? Copying the founder's gestures or preserving the values that made the company think clearly? The actual succession lesson favors values over gestures. Cook mattered because Apple needed continuity, not a costume. The non-reproducible part is equally important. Jobs had a particular life, wound, I, voice, timing, and authority. He arrived when personal computing, digital media, animation, mobile phones, and the internet were all ready for transformation. He had was at the beginning, Pixar during exile, I've during Apple's rebirth, Cook in operations, and enough public charisma to turn launches into cultural events. A different person copying only the behaviors may get the damage without the results. That is why the book is best read as a discipline mirror. If Jobs inspires you, ask which discipline you are actually willing to practice. Are you willing to simplify until good ideas die? Are you willing to study the user's full experience? Are you willing to protect taste when spreadsheets push toward average decisions? Are you willing to admit when a domain is outside your intuition? Are you willing to apologize where your standards become cruelty? The biography also asks what kind of company deserves loyalty. Jobs could make employees feel they were building history, not merely shipping units. That kind of meaning is rare and powerful. But meaning can also be used to excuse overwork, fear, and personal sacrifice. The ethical question is not whether mission matters. It does. The question is whether the mission respects the humans carrying it. Seen this way, Apple's products become physical chapters in Jobs' inner argument. The Apple II says technology can enter ordinary life. The Macintosh says computers can be humane. Next says perfection without market fit is not enough. Pixar says technology needs story. The iMac says design can restore company. The iPod says a device can reorganize a cultural habit. The iPhone says software can remake the most personal object people carry. The iPad says computing can become even more direct. Apple Park says Jobs wanted the company itself to live inside a designed environment. Suppose you line up the products like chapters instead of trophies. What would you expect to see? Separate inventions or one repeated argument about making tools disappear into human intention? The actual pattern is the repeated argument. Each product removes one more layer of friction between a person and an action. What ties those chapters together is not a single product category. It is the desire to remove the gap between human intention and machine behavior. Jobs wanted the tool to disappear into the act. Choose music, touch glass, move a picture, open a box, walk into a store, watch a film, make a call, browse the web. The less the user felt the machinery, the more successful the product became. This is the generous version of his legacy. The harsher version is that he often wanted people to disappear into his intention too. He could treat human beings as extensions of the product mission. He could demand that reality conform before he had earned the right to demand it. Isaacson's biography keeps both versions in view because both are true. Now step back and notice the full arc. A child who felt abandoned and chosen learns craftsmanship from his father, finds a technical partner in Woz, turns a hobbyist machine into a company, becomes wealthy too early, wounds people personally, discovers the graphical future, drives the Macintosh like a revolution, loses power, fails and learns it next, grows through Pixar, returns to a broken Apple, cuts it down to focus, rebuilds it through design, stores, music, phones, tablets, and finally confronts the one reality his will cannot. Master. That arc is why the biography remains powerful. It is not a manual with clean rules. It is a case study in how greatness can be inseparable from danger. Jobs' life shows what happens when taste becomes obsession, when focus becomes control, when vision becomes pressure, and when pressure sometimes produces beauty. It also shows that the same traits can create denial, cruelty, and loss. The most useful way to read this book is not to ask, was Steve Jobs good or bad? That question is too small. The better question is, which parts of his method created value? Which parts created unnecessary damage? And how can a builder learn from the first without excusing the second? For a founder, the book says, own the whole experience if the experience is what makes the product valuable. For a designer, it says, simplicity is not emptiness. It is the result of painful choices. For a manager, it says, focus is a discipline, not a mood. For a creator, it says, technology becomes powerful when it touches human feeling. For a human being, it says, brilliance does not cancel responsibility. One final prediction moment. Imagine two companies studying Jobs after his death. One copies the visible symbols, the secrecy, the harsh language, the dramatic launch, the founder mythology. The other copies the harder invisible disciplines, taste, focus, end-to-end responsibility, respect for craft, and the courage to remove what weakens the product. Which company would you expect to build something lasting? The actual lesson of the biography is that the second company understands Jobs better. The visible style was never the deepest source of power. Steve Jobs wanted to put a dent in the universe. Isaacson's biography shows that he did, but the dent was not clean. It ran through computers, music, phones, animation, retail, design, and the daily gestures of modern life. It also ran through families, colleagues, rivals, and his own body. The legacy is not a statue. It is a warning and an invitation. The invitation is to care more than the average person cares. Care about the hidden back of the cabinet. Care about the user's first touch. Care about whether a product has a soul. Care about focus enough to say no. Care about story enough to make people feel the future before they can measure it. The warning is to remember that reality is not always waiting to be bent. People are not products. Bodies are not deadlines. Families are not launch events. A beautiful machine does not repair a neglected relationship. A perfect interface does not excuse a cruel room. That is the full shape of Steve Jobs and Isaacson's telling. Not a saint, not a monster, not a simple genius, but a builder whose life forces a difficult standard. If you want to create something meaningful, taste and courage matter. If you want to remain human while doing it, humility and responsibility matter just as much. The book ends with invention, but its deeper ending is judgment. Jobs showed that the future is built by people who can see connections others miss. He also showed that seeing the future does not automatically teach you how to see the person in front of you. The practical takeaway is simple and hard. Build with the full force of your taste, but do not let your vision become an excuse to stop listening. The machine can be beautiful on the inside. The life has to be, too.